And tonight we are so pleased to welcome back Ann Fadiman. We decided it was an annual visit because Ann was here 2 years ago and then George was here last year, and now they're both back. She's going to talk about not her writing. Well, she did write the introduction to this one, but she's going to... The afterwards, sorry. But she's going to talk about her father, Clifton Fadiman's book, Wally the Wordworm. And for those of you who don't know, but I think most of you know her better than I, it sounds like, she is the Francis Writer in Residence and a professor of English at Yale, and she received her BA from Harvard. She's the author of several books, including the one that I first learned of her, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, that explores the cultural conflicts between a Hmong family and the American medical system, and it won a National Book Critics Circle Award. She also wrote Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader, a book about books, which is near and dear to my heart. And when she was here 2 years ago, she spoke about The Wine Lover's Daughter. And this is a memoir about her father, Clifton Fadiman, who, as Rob wrote this morning, was a jack of all trades in the literary world. He was a distinguished American intellectual, author, editor, radio and television personality. He was editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, book critic at The New Yorker, and it goes on. He wrote in her talk, she talked about the essay collections and other things he's written, and there were people who attended the talk who remembered Wally the Wordworm, which at that point in time was out of print. And that was a light bulb moment for me, because David Godine Publishers is a wonderful special house publishing house in New Hampshire, and David and I have known each other now for over 25 years, and in some rambling conversation, he asked that I let him know about books that were out of print that he might be able to bring back. So the next morning I emailed him, and fast forward 2 years, and there's a book. And Anne can say much more about the process. That makes it sound really simple. It was not, I understand. The illustrator, Arnold Roth, is now 90. And he is an award-winning cartoonist and illustrator whose work has been featured in Playboy, Punch, The New Yorker. And he was on board with the republication of the book, which is really exciting. And it may have helped a little bit that he is also the illustrator of a book, Speaking of Dogs, which is another Godine classic, which sadly we ran out of last week in not enough time to get it back in stock. So in preparing this introduction, I discovered a wonderful Clifton Fadiman quote that seemed too appropriate for tonight. Quote, "When you reread a classic, you do not see more in the book than you did before. You see more in you than was there before." Without further ado, please help me welcome Anne.
Thank you so much, Liza. Well, you stole the story from me about how this republished book was essentially born in this room 2 winters ago, when after I had done a reading from The Wine Lover's Daughter, someone in the audience raised a hand and said, "You know, my favorite book by your dad is out of print." And what was that book? Not one of his essay collections, but since I knew what I was about to hear, since this happened at almost every reading I did of The Wine Lover's Daughter, the answer was, it was a children's book called Wally the Wordworm. And Liza indeed emailed David Godine the next morning, and the rest is, if not history, at the very least, this republished edition, which looks exactly like the original, except that it's a little larger. So if my father indeed said, as Liza quoted, that when you reread a classic, you find more in you than there was before, when you reread this book, you find more in the worm than you did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, and then I'll read parts of it. And then if anybody has any questions about my father, or about children's literature, or about worms, or about anything else I've written, I would love to answer them. So, you've heard a little bit about my father, but you don't know what my father was like in his private life, an interruptible writer in midlife. I was born when he was almost 50. He worked at home. He had a very large office, and in that very large office, there was a chair with an ottoman. And my older brother, Kim, and I were allowed to interrupt him at any time. And we would go in and we would say, "Daddy, tell us a story." And he would sit on the chair. I still remember exactly what it looked like. And my brother, with whom I tried to align memories before I wrote the afterword to this book, remembered it exactly too. A sort of a mid-century modern chair, cream and black, with an oblong pattern that was imprinted into both of our minds, because one of us would sit in his lap and the other one would sit on the ottoman, and he would tell us stories. So, what Wally is about? Wally is the story of a bookworm, a wordworm, who is an actual slithery little worm. I'm not sure my father, when he started telling us stories about this worm, pictured him in his mind. He wasn't a very visual person, and for sure he wasn't an outdoorsy person. So whether he'd actually met an earthworm in the flesh, so to speak, I'm not sure. He certainly never went fishing. But this was a bookworm who ate words and who was both grumpy and hungry because the words in children's picture books were too damned short. So the stories were made up in order to teach Kim and me the fun of long words. So the plot basically is that Wally would be, I'm hungry, and then he finally finds his way to the dictionary, where he might discover, let us say, sesquipedalian, or syzygy, or on a bad day, paradichlorobenzene, which is a very bitter sort of insecticide. It doesn't taste good at all. My father liked Dr. Seuss books, but he hated Dick and Jane books. He once said, "The only way to enlarge a rubber band is to stretch it." And he was with E.B. White, who once famously said, "You should never write down to children, only up." Both of them believed that children were really the best audience, and that every pore was open. They wanted to be enlarged. They loved encountering words that they didn't know. And if you liked this book, once it came out in 1964, when this worm turned into a published worm, you really liked it. My friend Nancy Pick, a writer, has told me that when she was 8, she used to read Wally the Wordworm surreptitiously under the covers with a flashlight. It was her favorite book, and she has said that she might not have become a writer without Wally. So, when it was republished by David Godine, I was delighted that David wished to use the original illustrations by Arnold Roth. So, Arnold Roth, at the time, had never illustrated a children's book, and although he later became a well-known children's book illustrator and also a well-known New Yorker cartoonist, at that point he was known exclusively for his Playboy cartoons. My father didn't pick him. It was the editor at their original publishing house, and who was either zany enough or brilliant enough to say, that Arnie Roth, he draws really good pictures of semi-clothed women. He'd be great at drawing a worm. I consider this one of the great imaginative artistic leaps of all time. And the drawings are so weird and so detailed, just as weird and detailed as my father's text. He also later on did the covers of all of John Updike's Beck books, and John Updike wrote about him. All cartoonists are geniuses, but Arnold Roth especially so. The first time I saw a Roth drawing, I was zapped. Those shaggy zigzag lines, those pointy noses, those infinitely rubbery limbs. A superabundant creative spirit surges through a Roth drawing like electricity. The lines sizzle. So when Roth met Fadiman, sizzling definitely took place. So in order to understand the birth of the worm who preceded Wally, the worm that my father used to tell stories about on that chair and ottoman, we need to just go a little farther backward to the first series of stories that my brother and I remember that our father told us, not about Wally the Wordworm, about another series of stories, a kind of ongoing set of episodes about a rabbit named Miniature who was constantly pursued by an evil wolf named Wolfenstein. So Wolfenstein's only goal in life was to eat Miniature, and he never got to eat Miniature. The stories about Miniature the rabbit were always sort of enormously suspenseful, and Wolfenstein would be getting closer and closer, and Kim and I would be saying, no, Miniature, Wolfenstein is right over there. Well, however, Wolfenstein had swallowed a Steinway piano, which is why he was called Wolfenstein, and therefore always at just the, N-1 moment when Miniature was about to be ingested, the keys of this Steinway would tinkle, and thus giving away Wolfenstein's presence, and Miniature would escape. Now, Kim and I, of course, were always happy when Miniature escaped, and it was only after I grew up that I realized that in those stories, the character that my father identified with was not Miniature, was really sort of a boring little rabbit, but Wolfenstein. And I feel that just as Byron believed that Satan was the true hero of Paradise Lost, Wolfenstein, from my father's view, was the true hero of the Wolfenstein and Miniature sagas. The poignantly frustrated hero who never got what he wanted, and who represented my father's sad and dark side, which was usually overshadowed by his happy and cheery side, but it was there. So the plot, you'll remember, is about somebody who never gets to eat what he wants, whereas Wally the Wordworm is about somebody who always gets to eat what he wants. So I feel that after about a year or so of Miniature and Wolfenstein stories, my father decided he needed to make up another series of stories that would cheer him up, the kind of inverted image of the Wolfenstein stories about somebody else he deeply identified with, Wally the Wordworm, a worm who, like my father, loved reference books and also loved to eat. So Wally gets pleasantly rotund after eating some of these words and had a silhouette perhaps a little bit more like my father's. So we have these two series of stories, Wolfenstein and Miniature, that belonged to the great epic oral tradition, alas, never written down. And then we had Wally the Wordworm, who started off life being called Bertram the Bookworm, but Kim and I always felt Bertram was a kind of fussy British name, and we always were very happy that when my father finally wrote down the stories and published them as Wally the Wordworm, that he was a cooler and more sporty guy named Wally. So one essentially a tragedy, the other a comedy, with a very, very happy ending. I have a whole bookcase of my father's books. I'm his literary executor, and he edited many anthologies. There are 3 collections of his essays. There are many books to which he wrote the foreword or the afterword, but he always said that he had never written what he called a whole book. The definition of a whole book wasn't a collection of any sort, but something with a beginning and middle and end. Well, actually, he did write one whole book, and this is it. And now that this is back in print, of all my father's books, only 2 are in print, one called The New Lifetime Reading Plan, and now there is Wally. So tonight I'm actually not going to read the whole book. I'll read some parts of Wally, and then I hope you'll ask me some questions. And as I read this, I, of course, think of what my father's voice was like as he pronounced all of these vocabulary words that he would kind of sneak into our lives as Wally ate them. And he would always say, syzygy, now you say it. And I love the thought of parents and grandparents all over the place reading these long words in Wally the Wordworm and then turning to the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8-year-old to whom they're reading it and saying, now you say it. Wally the Wordworm was still hungry. He'd already eaten the headlines on page 1 of the morning newspaper, quickly swallowed. 6 good humor wrappers, just the wrappers. Peanut brittle and caramel crunch were the only satisfying ones. They were words you could really chew. And a picture book with only 70 different words in it, all short, flat, bare, dull, poor, thin, old ones that kept repeating themselves. They were good enough for a stupid worm, for a slow worm, for a worm who didn't care about real nourishment, but not good enough for Wally. I'm still hungry, said he. In fact, I am voracious. You see, Wally liked new words, big words, short, funny words, words that stretched with sound and meaning, words that make interesting noises inside your head, words with strange faces that look interesting, like syzygy and pix and whinnem, which you can't very well pronounce unless you whinny like a horse, and which is the name of a fine race of talking horses that can be found in a book called Gulliver's Travels. Wally the Wordworm not only liked to eat words, he liked to meet them, greet them, and repeat them. So he slithered and slathered and wiggled and waggled his way into the library until he found a big, fat book called Dictionary. This book was filled, stuffed, packed, bulging, crammed, and jammed with words of all shapes and sizes. Said Wally. Ha, said Wally, and ho-ho, said Wally, and whoops, said Wally. Just my dish, just my dish. And he licked his lips and crawled inside. He started near the back with a word just right for a hungry growing worm. Sesquipedalian, said Wally. That means long word and looks like it too. This went down pretty well, and Wally looked around for another sesquipedalian. And on this page we see one of my favorite illustrations in which he's no longer a long, thin worm. He looks rather like a balloon. There we have him. He turned the pages and found dwindle. Now that's the kind of word I like for dessert, said Wally. It's new and fresh and it makes me laugh when I say it. Dwindle. I'll give it a try. First he ate the big D in dwindle. Capital eating, said Wally, who was fond of jokes like that. My father was rather overly fond of them. That left windle. Then he ate the W. That left indle. Then he ate the I. That left ndle. Then he ate the N. That left dull. Then he ate the D. That left ul. Then he ate the L. That left E period. Then he ate the E. That left a period. Good to the last spot, said Wally, and he ate that too. And this, remarked Wally, taking a bow, is how dwindle dwindled. A most enjoyable word lesson. Spelled, I regret to say, L-E-S-S-E-N. Now Wally was feeling proud and a bit frisky. He flipped through the pages. Even a worm will turn, you know, he said, and stopped at the P's. Here he met a word that was absolutely new to him, palindrome. The dictionary told him that a palindrome is a word or verse or sentence that reads the same backward or forward, like madam. Well, of course, Wally had to test this for himself. So first he crawled forward from M to M, and then he crawled backward from M to M, and was pleased to discover that the dictionary was right. Either way, he spelled out M-A-D-A-M. After a while, he wasn't sure whether he was coming or going. It was easy to think of words like pup or tot or gag and look them up and palindrome on them. But these exercises were too simple for a smart worm. By great good luck, on his next palindrome hunt, he discovered deified. D-E-I-F-I-E-D. Neat, cried Wally. He could hardly believe it. He crawled forward letter by letter, and he crawled backward letter by letter, repeating the performance a dozen times, and each time good old deified spelled itself correctly. It was magic. Wally was spellbound. So I'll skip to near the end. In the course of his word hunt, Wally met a number of imaginary creatures. Centaur, which is only half an animal, and chimera, which is really 3 animals. Also the roc, the unicorn, the phoenix, and the Cheshire cat. It's a funny thing, thought Wally. These animals aren't really alive. They live only in the dictionary and in the imagination. Yet they'll still be alive in those 2 places thousands of years from now, when lots of real animals may have died out entirely. Wally shook his brain. Such deep thinking tired him. He decided he needed a little food to pick up his spirits. Quickly and deftly he swallowed eft, a very small word indeed, and also a very small lizard. A few pages later he came to escalator. The up and down of it sounded ticklish, so he ate escalator too, and the eft got a free ride, both bound for the inside or interior of Wally. 0 was Wally's last treat for the day. Tastes like nothing at all, he said, and with a gulp sat down on the last page to think about all he had discovered. Hundreds of words, some peculiar, some funny, all interesting. After so many hours of pages, all Wally could say was fatiguing. He wasn't tired of words, far from it. He was sure he would never get tired of words, the noises they made, the pictures they painted, and that was the problem. It had been a long day, and the light was fading. He waved goodbye to Zymergy and crawled away singing. And this is Wally's word song. The auk and the yak and the cassowary, they're all to be discovered in the dictionary. So's the jerboa, so's the moa, and so are the boa and the protozoa. And words my father and mother say, like income tax and PTA. So down with the books that treat me like a baby, chuck 'em out the window, and I don't mean maybe. I'll tell you the conclusion I have come to. It is that I am tired of the cat who is sitting on the mat. I know my A's and I know my Z's, and I can pronounce all kinds of diseases. Who is K, and where is Q, and what is kale? You don't? I do. I'm the only worm on the block who knows what palindromes are, and punctilios, or who knows that a tuberose isn't a rose. I'm the only worm on the block who knows. A scary and a wherry and a lamasery are all to be found in the dictionary, along with a flume and a fluke and a flu, kleptomaniac, kickapoo, Kliegleitz, kumquat, kokomo. I'll never have to wonder what they are. I know. So I'm wondering whether anyone has any questions about children's literature, my father's relation to children's literature, worms, or anything else.
What age bracket would you say as a gift?
I think 4 to 8.
4 to 8.
Although even younger children, you
They'll
can
be
read
mesmerized,
to,
they won't
just
understand.
love the pictures, and it's so fun to read aloud. Also, little children can learned some very difficult words. We've all known 2-year-olds who knew the names of dinosaurs that we don't even know because they didn't know they were difficult, they were just interested. But I think 4 to 8.
I was thinking that my 60-year-old son would love that.
Perfect age bracket as well. Maybe especially if you read it aloud to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
You said your dad was a great storyteller, but did he read to you, many books as well? Or
Yes, he certainly did, although we both learned to read pretty young, so we would read in bed at night. So a lot of the storytelling was during the day, but yes, he also read aloud, as did our mother, who was a journalist. So she was a writer too. She had been the only woman war correspondent in China during the Second World War. So they were both wordworms in their way. So I remember being read, for example, all of the Oz stories, not just the Wizard of Oz. Our mother read us a lot of the Oz stories because before she had gone to China as a war correspondent, she had been a screenwriter at MGM, and on the summer that she arrived, The Wizard of Oz was being made, and she remembers being in the commissary with the Munchkins at lunch. She would tell us those stories, but some of them our father also read. No, she didn't. But she. Interesting, yeah, but she got to know Judy Garland when she was in The Wizard of Oz and then wrote a movie for Judy Garland. But I remember my father also always, just the way, as I say, that he didn't believe that writers should condescend to children. He believed that children were the best judges of books. So I've been thinking of him a lot this year. I was just explaining to Liza that our own house is just overrun with books because I'm a Pulitzer juror in nonfiction, and we've gotten at least 300 books since June. And I remember our house looking exactly like that, but with children's books when I was 7. And I should look up and see what award it was. Maybe I don't know whether it was Newbery or the National Book Award, but my father was a judge and was sent a ton of children's books. And it was fantastic because my brother and I were permitted to read any of them, and my father would always ask our opinion. And I'm pretty sure that the winner that year, and we said this is the best one, they're written by the same author, and I'm sure, Liza, you will remember the name of the author. The Trouble with Jenny's Ear and The Enormous Egg were both written by the same author, and I think one of them won that year. Anybody remember? No, it was a man. In any case, I remember my father consulting us as if our opinions mattered, and as I think back, of course they mattered. We were, we were the audience, and we had either read so many children's books or had them read to us that we could compare these new ones that came flooding into our house with all the great ones. And I remember that one of the books that came, it was one of the Narnia books. It was The Magician's Nephew. So that was the first C.S. Lewis book that I ever read. Then for many years, the Narnia books were my very favorite books. So in our house, children's literature was not viewed as something lesser, if anything, something more. My father became quite an authority on children's literature. He had planned to write a whole book, which he never finished, that was going to be a critical history of children's literature. And in his 60s and 70s, he learned 4 or 5 languages, at least at sort of children's book level, including Portuguese and Swedish, so he could read these books in the original. And he never finished the book, but he did contribute an article on children's literature to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And he once said in his old age that of everything he'd written in his whole life, that was what he was proudest of. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I have 6 sisters, and we spanned 16 years. And so a huge number of books passed through us
Sure.
and were chewed up by us. And I'm curious to know if ever came across your paths some of the books from Europe, the Wonderful Adventure, Marvelous Adventures of
Nils.
Niels Holgersson.
Nil,
And-
Wonderful
and
Adventures,
Five
of course.
Children in It. the
Yes,
Nesbit
oh,
books.
Enid Blyton.
Blyton,
No,
Nesbit,
not Enid
Nesbit.
Blyton, no, Enid Nesbit, exactly, yes, of
And
course.
all those, and
We read all of
are there
those.
some that we missed, because, were there some that you remember that, you'd like to throw out our way?
Oh, gosh, no, I do remember those. We definitely had those on the shelves. Those were absolutely marvelous. Thinking about books being passed down and relatives, I had a wonderful experience along those lines just recently when I was giving a reading in San Francisco of my memoir about my father, the wine lover's daughter, and my cousin, John, came to the reading and presented me with a book at the end, and it was a Dr. Seuss book, McGillicuddy's Pool, and he said, oh, I think you should have this back. And apparently, my mother had given all of our children's books away to the cousins, because they were all younger, but this one inside had a fish drawn by Dr. Seuss with a little inscription that said, an extra fish for Anne. So I had not read McGillicuddy's Pool since I was about 6. Does anybody remember it? It's not one of his best known books, but it really has the same theme in a way as Wally the Woodworm. It's about the marvelous discovery of one's imaginative powers, and it's about a little boy who is trying to fish from a little pool, and oh, you'll never catch anything there. Well, but what if the pool is connected to an underground river? And what if the river is connected to the sea? And if my line is long enough, my hook is long, who knows what I might get? And this little boy imagines all the amazing, non-existent, but far greater than any real fish that he might catch. And so here too, it's let's just apply a little imagination. What might happen if we viewed a reference book not as a boring thing on our parents' shelves, but as a place for adventures? So now the Extra Fish for Anne is back. And so someday I'll be able maybe to pass down, if my children have children. So I have this wonderful inscription by Arnold Roth in my copy. So it says, for thee, Anne, good luck. And then there's this sort of worm-like creature with kind of whiskers, and it says, Wally's Gramp. So of course, Barney is now 90. And then Wally's Gramp says, he's in the family. And I think an even more wonderful inscription was done by Arnie, whom I met for the first time when I read from this book in New York City. And Arnie came, and I'd had extensive email correspondence, mostly with his wife Caroline, as this went through the publishing process, but I'd never met Arnie, and I was so excited that he could come. And he started, instead of writing stuff, he just started drawing pictures. And a former student of mine came up and said, could you make this out for my nephew, Avery, who is about to be the ring bearer in a wedding? And Arnie thought for a moment, and it was like giving an improv prompt. This is like an improv genius, where you can sort of see the idea percolating, and then his face lit up, and it covered out an entire page. He drew a strong man with giant biceps going like this, and above it was a giant ring with a sparkly diamond at the top for the ring bearer, and it said, for Avery the Mighty. Yes.
There's a question. Did your father work with Arnie Roth, or
No.
did he have opinions about the
He
work?
loved the pictures, but I had always hoped, of course, my father's been dead since 1999, so I couldn't ask him. The editor is dead, but Arnie is still alive, and so I asked Arnie early on whether my father had chosen him. I wouldn't put it past my father to have been a secret devotee of Playboy, so I thought maybe he thought, this guy is perfect for this. But in fact, that hadn't been the case. The choice was made by the editor, and they didn't meet until after the book was published. But my father loved the illustrations, and one of the things about them is that they're not the standard condescending pastel colors of most children's book illustrations. There's sort of, there's a lot, this is the palette, And it's a very uncondescending palette.
Almost in your face.
Almost in your face. But I think my favorite, there's this wonderful spread where my father had introduced the names of these great mythical creatures of the world in the passage that I read. And there's this wonderful picture that has a very ornate museum-like frame around it, in which we have the rock, and we see how big the rock is because he's holding a rather nonplussed elephant, and it looks very small. The unicorn, the phoenix, the Cheshire cat, and Wally. So here are the great mythical beasts of the world, and I love that Wally was made one of them by Arnold, Roth. Yeah, our big problem with the cover was the placement of the barcode. In the original version that was sent, there are these niches, and I'll show you in a second. I don't want to give away the solution. There are these wonderful niches in the back with sort of different words and pictures, and then the last one was simply called a word, and then the barcode was just sort of slapped randomly, kind of in the middle of the back, and I said, this doesn't work at all. Put it in the last niche, and then have a caption that says barcode. And so I wrote to Arnie and said, what do you think? And Arnie said, I love it. So, so I feel extremely proud. This was my only visual contribution to this edition. And we had them actually redo all the other captions so the fonts could match exactly on the back cover. Any other questions?
Two questions.
Please, yes.
Well, I have read The Wine Lover's Daughter, and I adore that book. And I am about to give it to 2 people. And I think it's valuable. We have a whole country full of people who are rounding on to 80 now, and 70s and 80s. And we want to hear some voices of those who went before. What is it like out there? And one of the most telling and beautiful stories you told in The Wine Lover's Daughter of your father when he became suddenly blind, and how that ended is extraordinary.
Well, shall I tell the story?
Yes, tell it.
So, as you've heard, my father's whole life revolved around reading and writing.
And wine.
And wine, yes. His professional life revolved around reading and writing, and of course he loved to read and write, and books and wine were the 2 things he loved most in his life. And when he was 88, he had just done an anthology of the best pieces ever published in the Encyclopedia Britannica since the first edition, so he just, he'd been reading old editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica all year, so he could read extremely well. And then over the course of 4 days, all of a sudden, he couldn't see the E at the top of an eye chart. It was misdiagnosed by his local doctor. He was living in Florida at the time with my mom, and I took him across Florida on sort of a hurricane to the famous eye hospital in Miami, where he was told he had something called acute retinal necrosis, and he would never see the E at the top of an eye chart again. Fortunately, they were able to tack down a few retinal remnants so that he could see kind of light and dark, and he didn't bump into things, but he was never going to read again. And so that night I spent on a cot in his room at the hospital, and he said, if I can't read or write, my life is over. Will you help me commit suicide? And I said, well, why don't you try your damnedest for the next 6 months, and then we'll talk again. And I didn't say that in 6 months I'd help him, but I didn't say that I wouldn't. And so I knew I'd be sitting on the edge of my chair for the next 6 months. He agreed, and as part of his promise to try his damnedest, he went to a course for newly blinded and partially sighted adults, most of them very old, in Fort Myers, for 6 weeks, I think. And he learned to do stuff like, open a milk carton and special ways
The
of.
first day when he came back.
You know, the first day when he came back, thank you for coaching me. I'd forgotten the best line. I was back in New York by then, and he called up. Then I really was sitting on the edge of my chair to see how this has gone, and he said, "Well, that was possibly the most interesting day of my life," and I thought he was being ironic. He said, "Aside from the first day of my life, I learned more new things today than I have ever learned." So he learned to do a lot of, like, I don't know, full socks and squeeze a toothpaste tube and things like that. And he pretty much outsourced all manual activity except opening wine bottles to, wives and servants. And so for him, actually, to be able to pour and squeeze and so on and not make a mess and feel he could do it well was pretty darn exciting. And while he was there, he was also introduced, of course, to recorded books. He ultimately had one player upstairs and one downstairs. He was very proud at being able to press all the buttons correctly. He would listen for hours every day. Some of the people who were there had actually, quite a few of them had listened to him when he was on the radio and Information Please. So they couldn't see him, but it didn't matter. They couldn't see him when he was on the radio either. And they were very, very excited to hear this famous voice, Clifford Fadiman's voice. So some of them said, "We want Mr. Fadiman to ourselves a little bit more. Couldn't he have like a little group with us?" So he started Fadiman's conversation class. He assigned homework the first day. He had 5 members of his class. It eventually grew to, 15 or something. And he had them listen to Larry King's radio show. And then he asked them questions about it the next day. And of course, he spent his whole life in radio being an MC and the host of various things since then. And it apparently went really well. So when he called after that, he said, "Oh, it was great. Your old man is back at his old job." And I thought that maybe he might want to write about this stuff at some point. So I took notes. I thought he might dictate an essay about being blind that might make him feel it was worth living. And he didn't end up wanting to write anything, but when I wrote my memoir, I realized I had a folder of notes. So I had all this stuff verbatim, all these phone calls, and I was able to persuade the president of the Book of the Month Club, where he had been a judge for 60 years, not to fire him, but instead to spend the money that had normally been spent once a month to fly him in from Florida to New York and put him up at a really fancy hotel, and instead sent all that money to out-of-work Juilliard graduates, these young, starving actors who would read aloud the manuscripts on cassette tapes, FedEx them to my father, who would, be able to put them in the, he got so expert, and he got so fond of his readers that he started telling them, "And when you finished reading them, could you spend a minute or two at the end telling me what you thought of them?" So it was just like him, saying, "So what did you think with the trouble of Jenny's ear?" So he never mentioned suicide again, and he lived to 95.
That's an important story.
And he had always thought of himself as kind of a coward. His age was such that he was too young to fight in World War I and too old to fight in World War II, and he was this indoorsy guy. I mean, not only did he never meet a worm, but he just never met any kind of outdoor adventure. Whereas my mother was a very physically brave person. So he went through life thinking he was this kind of, intelligent wuss. And he was quite surprised to find that he could rise to this occasion, one that anybody would think was difficult at such an advanced age, and continue to work within I guess maybe 3 weeks of his death, which was quite remarkable.
It's a wonderful book, all in all.
Oh, well, thank you. Does anybody have one last short question, and then I'll sign?
That last part you read in Wally reminded me of H.H. Belloc.
Oh, yes.
Did he read?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. I remember a lot of Belloc books on the shelf. Yeah, my father was very much influenced by, Belloc, Edward Lear, Lewis
Ogden
Carroll, Ogden Nash. he loved doggerel. He loved light verse was absolutely a favorite, and he wrote a lot of limericks and clerihews himself. And a clerihew is a very short biographical poem, and his limericks were really wonderful. So I think it was fun for him to be able to write the end of this book in verse and see whether he could write something that was sort of up there with the greats, and I'm sure he felt that it wasn't up there with the greats, but at least was a kind of homage to them. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.